the Bible is often viewed through the lens of good versus evil. But an unsettling question arises from its pages: who is responsible for more death? When counting specific mentions in the text, the numbers are stark. God is directly credited with over 2 million deaths, from plagues, wars, and acts of divine retribution. This count excludes the flood, which alone is estimated in the millions. In contrast, Satan is directly credited with only a handful of deaths, notably the 10 children and servants of Job, which he was only permitted to cause. The conclusion, based solely on biblical statistics, is a challenging one: the death toll attributed to the devil is vastly, overwhelmingly lower than that attributed to God. The biblical record of death presents a chilling paradox. While God is universally portrayed as the loving creator, a meticulous count of specific casualties shows his direct involvement in death far surpasses that of his adversary, Satan. This is not merely a statistical curiosity, but a profound theological distinction that hinges on the nature of their agency. God's high death toll is the direct result of divine judgment and the enforcement of a moral covenant. Consider the Great Flood, a cataclysmic event where all but 8 souls were wiped out, an unquantifiable, immense loss attributed to God's decision to reset a world consumed by wickedness. Or the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, where fire and brimstone were delivered as a consequence of their sin. Even within the history of Israel, God is recorded as eliminating massive numbers, such as the 14,700 who died in the wilderness plague or the 185,000 Assyrian soldiers struck down in a single night by an angel of the Lord. In stark contrast, Satan's role in death is consistently depicted as limited and indirect. His most famous attempt to cause death, in the book of Job, required explicit permission from God to proceed. Even then, the 10 deaths of Job's children and servants serve primarily to test a human being's faith, not to fulfill a sweeping divine decree. The narrative reveals that God is the ultimate authority over life and death, acting as both judge and executioner. His actions are final, swift, and often massive in scale, driven by the need to maintain cosmic order and holiness. Satan, however, is a subordinate figure whose influence is manipulative and reliant on human compliance. The numbers, therefore, are not a measure of who is more evil, but a clear indicator of who holds supreme authority and power within the biblical cosmology. One wields the axe of ultimate justice, the other merely whispers the temptation that merits it. Moving beyond the initial statistical shock, modern interpretation seeks to grapple with the theological implications of God's overwhelmingly higher death toll. This deeper analysis hinges on defining responsibility in the biblical context. If we look past the direct actions, does the devil's indirect influence tip the scales? Satan is identified as the author of sin and the great deceiver. Consequently, every act of murder, every war, every plague resulting from human moral failure can be traced back to the original temptation and fall. When humanity chooses conflict, hate, and transgression, these deaths, millions upon millions across history, are arguably the indirect, yet devastating, results of the devil's influence on free will. However, this count remains philosophical, as the Bible explicitly attributes these specific deaths to the choices of men, or to God's judicial response to those choices. Furthermore, we must address the concept of divine sovereignty. From a traditional theological viewpoint, nothing occurs outside of God's ultimate allowance or permission. Therefore, if God is the ultimate final authority, the distinction between a direct kill and a permitted one becomes a matter of mechanism, not ultimate responsibility. Finally, the New Testament introduces a crucial distinction between physical and spiritual death. In this light, Satan's most profound and damaging work is not measured in physical bodies, but in the spiritual death of souls. God's act of sending Christ is then reframed not as another act of judgment, but as the ultimate solution to the death that sin, fomented by the devil, brought into the world. The numbers, therefore, only tell part of the story. The real drama is the contrast between God's perfect justice and his redemptive mercy.